Hi, I'm Michael Wyetzner, and I've been an architect for 35 years. And today I'm breaking down some of the hidden architectural details from the film The Gran Budapest Hotel. Let's take a look at the exterior of the hotel.
A picturesque, elaborate, and once widely celebrated establishment.
So here's what jumps out at me. First off, it's obviously a model, it's fake. And I think that's the director letting everybody know that this is a fantasy and it's not real.
I beg your pardon?
The other thing that jumps out at me is that it's sort of this French chateau growing out of the mountain. And so you've got these two turrets on either side with domes on top. There's a mansard roof with these curved dormers on them. And mansard roofs were developed in the 1600s by an architect named Mansard in Paris. And they were used to skirt the zoning laws of the time, to get an extra floor on top of their buildings, because a regular roof is peaked like this, but a mansard roof, it angles out and you are able to inhabit that top floor. It's resting on this very rusticated, almost infrastructure-like base that looks like it could be supporting an aqueduct, and that gives it the idea that it's sort of growing out of the mountain. And the canopy above the entrance appears to be an Art Nouveau canopy, something you would see at the entrance to the subway in Paris or Belgium. So this image appears to be like one of those sanatoriums that you would see in the mountains of Europe up until the 1930s. People went there to recover from tuberculosis quite often, or other ailments, even sometimes just to recharge their batteries. And they were resorts, but they also had a whole sort of health club and spa side to them. And typically these hotels were for very wealthy people who would have extended stays, sometimes for a month or more.
Times have changed.
Okay, let's take a look at the entrance to the funicular. So what jumps out at me immediately is he's created this grand arch, and arches were built by, starting with the Romans, to celebrate an event or a victory or a conquest. But arches are essentially portals, and they take you from one place into another place. And in this case, it's the entrance to a whole other world, to this mountaintop retreat. Okay, let's take a look at the entrance to the hotel.
Each month, his emissary, known as Deputy Kovacs, arrived to review the books and convey messages on behalf of the mysterious proprietor.
So the first thing that jumps out at me is that it clearly does not match the long shot that we saw earlier. But there are these very ornate columns flanking the entrance with globe light fixtures on them. There are these arched windows above those, and there's this curved window above the entrance. It's a very diminutive-sized entrance for a building this big and this grand. And there's just one entrance door. And also, the name of the hotel in the previous shot was shown way up high, and here it's just above the door. So there's all this sort of decoration that's done in gold on this very white background, which is very reminiscent of the secessionist era of design. And the secessionists were basically seceding from the academy, the really stuffy, conservative art movements that had reigned over Europe for the 19th century. And this was a whole break. And the idea was that it was total design, where they were going to unify architecture, painting, and the decorative arts. And in this image here, you can see a lot of elements from that, including the decorative forms which grow out of nature, these leaf and flower-like patterns. You can see these stem and stalk-like patterns under the curved window, and you can see the window grates as well. All very soft, flowing forms that are very reminiscent of that movement. Okay, let's go inside.
They had to be rich, old, insecure.
So we're looking at this multi-story entrance lobby, and what jumps out at me immediately is the circular desk in the center, the grand chandelier above it, the stone base at the ground floor or the lowest level, and we're looking back out through the entrance doors, and you can see that it has the same motif as that exterior door where it's got that circle inside the arch. So it has this stone at the base. The stone's the most expensive, but it's also representative of the earth. As the atrium rises, it gets stripped down and lighter as it moves up towards the sky. So the people who built this hotel, the stone is more expensive than everything else, than the plaster above, so they put it down low where everyone could see it, feel it, touch it. So actually, this was filmed in an old department store, the Gorlitzer Warenhause in Germany, in a town called Gorlitz. So this was quite common for department store architecture. You could see it here in New York at the old Wanamaker's in Philadelphia, at the Gum department store in Moscow, or Galerie Lafayette in Paris, where they built these multi-story atriums to really wow people and to bring them into the store and to eventually buy stuff. That evolved into the mall, where you got multiple stores, but eventually eventually, I think space became a premium and it was more important to put as much merchandise on the floor as possible, and these sort of grand spaces were just taken over by merchandise. So here's another view of this really grand space, and it's got this great skylight on the top, so it's flooded with light. It's really ornate. The panes are very small. Obviously, glass was very expensive. It was very difficult to make large panes of glass. So they took advantage of that and they made these really beautiful, ornate mullion patterns. That sits on top of this very odd, thickened arches that support the ring that the skylight sits on. And then those arches are supported by these funny columns, which are obviously, this is all decoration, because typically when you'd have columns supporting something, there'd be columns underneath them. And you could see that there's nothing below them. So the other thing that really jumps out at me about this space is this stair that they built that sort of comes out into the middle of the space. And typically when you build an atrium like this, quite often you can't get into the middle of the space. You could see it from the sides, from the edges, or from below, but you never really get into the middle of the space and stand under the skylight as you can here. So they're allowing the viewer to see what has been created and what has been built. And in some of the overhead shots in the film, you could actually see some of the hints of the tile work between the carpets. So what's really interesting to me is sort of how this space is starting to transition from this very sort of decorative, heavy stone base, and then it sort of lightens as it goes up, but also gets much more industrial, because that's the time, actually, that this takes place in. And you can see that the steel is exposed on the stair and on the rail and in the skylight. So we're moving from this much more sort of decorated stone and plasterwork into a much more industrialized flavor where they're embracing these new technologies.
More flavorful, so they say.
Let's take a closer look at the stairs. So here's what jumps out at me right away, is that you see the stonework that we were just looking at the base. You could see these two lamps that sort of demarcate the staircase that brings you up to the desk. And then these two really stripped down Doric columns that flank the entrance to that desk. And then this really bright red at the back, so it pulls your eye all the way in. So this is interesting to me because typically architects try and avoid color because it can become dated very quickly.
The color is completely wrong.
Oh, really? Don't you like it?
It's not that I don't like it. I am physically repulsed.
And they use a really interesting combination, more of like what a painter would do than what an architect would do, with these pinks and sort of pale creams at the top, and then this bright red, and again these pinks at the bottom, and these oranges. But obviously this is a film, and they want it to be as rich and sort of over the top as it can be. And the red has this effect of drawing your eye right into the middle. The other salient characteristic about this shot is how symmetrical it is. And symmetry is something that is used in architecture all the time, and it goes back to being human. We're very comfortable with symmetry because we're symmetrical, right down the middle. It's a very easy design motif because it balances immediately. And that ties in to the Wes Anderson sort of motif, which is very formal and symmetrical. Let's take a look at the bathhouse.
A lobby boy is completely invisible, yet always in sight.
So what we have here is another multi-story atrium space, actually, but very different from what we saw in the lobby of the hotel. Here it's almost Romanesque with these very simple arches on brick piers. So the first thing that jumps out at me is that it's a totally different building. You can tell by the treatment of the arches sitting on the brick piers and the more stripped down brick piers above that and the white arches there. You could also see it in its very different tile pattern around the somewhat small pool, which is a little odd, but it's more like a ceremonial pool or almost what you'd find for physical therapy, which is sort of appropriate for this kind of spa-like hotel. So in the early 20th century, in New York, for instance, bathhouses were quite common because the working class, where they lived, they didn't really even have plumbing. So the only place they can go and take a bath were at these public bathhouses that were scattered throughout the city. And a lot of those bathhouses actually ended up becoming recreation centers because they had large pools, and some of them were even built with gymnasiums. But in this case, with such a small pool, it's intended for a much more sort of therapeutic use.
The thermal baths are very beautiful.
Okay, let's talk about the dining hall. So this is a wide shot of the dining hall, but now we're in the Soviet era, in the 1960s. We're no longer in the Austro-Hungarian period that the film begins in. So clearly the hotel is on hard times, and I love what they did here in this arrangement, that instead of keeping all the tables close together in, say, one portion of the room, they use the entire room and they make this array of 20 tables in a really precise manner, and they're all super far apart. Because one of the rituals of dining, especially in a multi-table dining room, is that you're all together and there's a whole sort of energy created by that. And here that's completely eliminated. So there's this huge landscape painting in the back, which was also part of the hotel in the 1930s. And in this case, it's a painting of the Alps, which is where this hotel is located. But there was also a whole school of these huge landscape paintings, particularly the Hudson River School here in New York, where some of the paintings were so ornate and so large that they would actually go on tour as like a form of entertainment, and people would pay to go see them because they were such a spectacle. So in this case, it's just another part of the hotel that shows off its grandeur. So let's take a look at some of the images of the hotel when they fast forward into the 1960s.
It was off-season, and by that time decidedly out of fashion, and it had already begun its descent into shabbiness.
So the first thing I see is the turrets are still here, but now they have antennae on top of them instead of domes. And it speaks very much to communications and to satellites. I really love this shot because they took what used to look like a French chateau and they've turned it into a Soviet-era bureaucratic building. The turrets are still there, but now they've taken the main section and they've framed it and they put these small punched windows in it. So Soviet architecture has this reputation for being very drab and very sad almost, but they are one of the originators of modernism with the constructivist movement. And this is very reminiscent of something Corbusier designed in Moscow in the 1920s.
What few guests we were had quickly come to recognize one another by sight as the only living souls residing in the vast establishment.
So obviously now the lobby is totally different. It's the 1960s. The first thing that strikes you is the signage, the lit reception sign, the white on black signs that are just stuck on the desk. I love that they have dental clinic appointments on the left, chambermaids available on the right. The desk is made out of what appears to be some sort of plastic laminate or formica, as it's commonly called. The colors have been changed. Now it's sort of this ochre and light avocado green, where before it was that really, really ornate red that drew you to the back. Now it's just sort of this orangey color. The columns are still there flanking that what was the concierge desk in the back, but there's no longer that ornate round desk in the center. And the ceiling particularly is the biggest issue. Now they've installed what is this illuminated ceiling, which is a real modernist idea. You could see it at the Seagram building in New York or the famous manufacturer's Hanover Bank on Fifth Avenue, just north of the library, where the whole ceiling glows, and it's a very modernist idea. But for a hotel like this, it's really sort of an anachronism, something that just really doesn't belong. So all this modernist bric-a-brac is almost like an invasion, and the hotel lobby has been taken over, and it just barely peeks out of what it used to be. So again, the filmmakers now are using color, but in a different way to convey something else, where before it was this sort of ornate and very rich reds and oranges and pinks. Now it's these sort of much more austere kind of sage green and yellow ochres and these much more sort of 60s modernist colors. So earlier we talked about how architects try to avoid using color because it dates really quickly. And this is a perfect example of how the colors they used here brings us right to the 1960s. So clearly the filmmakers are trying to show that the hotel has lost all its grandeur and all of its beauty and opulence, and this image shows that perfectly.
What more is there to say?
So there you go. Those are some of the architectural details that I noticed in the Grand Budapest Hotel. What show or movie should we look at next? Let me know in the comments below.